So, welcome to the central nervous system, our second nervous system video. So first, let's talk about the parts of the brain. This is an exterior view of the brain, and we're looking at the lobes. So we have the frontal lobe, which sits behind your forehead. We have the temporal lobe, which sits behind your jaw and ear. The parietal lobe, which sits right on top of your brain. It is right underneath like your skull cap. And then the occipital lobe sits right underneath the occipital bone, and it is right above your spine, where your spine enters to your skull. You will also notice that I have some broad categories of what the lobes do. So the frontal lobe is responsible for voluntary movement, expressive language, higher executive functions. The temporal lobe processes auditory information and encodes your memories. The parietal lobe processes touch information and organizes sensory information, all types of sensory information. And then the occipital lobe is visual processing, and that includes processing the color, shape, and movement of any given object. This slide just goes into more detail about those things. I just wanted to throw that in here so you had it as a resource, but the only thing you might want to add is that taste is also processed deep in the brain, kind of underneath, on the kind of underside of the frontal lobe, which is the only thing here that they add. But we will also have another slide that will also be in your notes that kind of goes into more detail than this. So let's look at the inside of the brain. So this is a cross section of the brain, and you can kind of label those different sections on your diagram. But I also want to add what these things do. So you have the fornix, which is memory processing. You have the hypothalamus that controls temperature, heart rate, and hunger. The cingulate gyrus is for processing emotion and behavioral regulation. Then we have the corpus callosum, which facilitates communication between the two sides of the brain. We have the pituitary, which regulates growth, metabolism, reproduction. We have the brainstem, which the brainstem is divided into 3 parts, and we'll talk about each part individually. But the brainstem as a whole is responsible for the automatic functions, the things that you need to take care of that you don't want to consciously worry about. So starting with the first section of the brainstem there, the midbrain, this is regulation of movement for both the head and the body. The pons is really involved in the sleep-wake cycle and breathing. And the medulla, sometimes referred to as the medulla oblongata, is responsible for respiration as well, cardiac functions, and vasodilation and your reflexes. The cerebellum is responsible for posture, balance, coordination, making sure you're able to walk, eye movements, and speech. The cerebellum is one of the common places where injuries occur during a concussion, which is often why balance is part of the concerns after a severe concussion. Then we have I'm not worried about the colliculus. Don't worry about those 2 parts. I'm not gonna have you know those, but I am worried about you knowing the pineal gland, which is responsible for the release of melatonin and regulates monitoring the light-dark cycle. So it's keeping track of when it is light and when it is dark. I wanted to throw this one in here because there is a piece of the brain that isn't on the previous diagram that I wanted you to have, and that is the amygdala. The amygdala is a really important structure in the brain, as it is responsible for triggering the release of adrenaline. And that adrenaline release is responsible for our fight, flight, or freeze response. So how do we respond to dangerous situations or things that put us under stress? And so I wanted to make sure that we talked about the amygdala. So you might want to make sure that you add that on there. And then this is that diagram that's actually in your note packet, and is the thing that I will use to quiz you over the functional areas of the brain. It just doesn't have parts listed, it just has areas, which I like a little bit better because it has some it's more accurate to the way the brain is, but I also want you to kind of know what those parts are as well, and kind of give you an idea of where the functionality is occurring as it relates to the actual structures that you need to know. So that's why I kind of went through some of these things before. I do want to draw your attention to number 4 and number 11. 4 is Broca's area. This is where we produce speech. This is actually where we are able to formulate what we want to say and then move the muscles to make that happen. That is all controlled in Broca's area. If we have damage to Broca's area, we often will lose the ability to make coherent sentences. However, we have found that there's a workaround for this. Singing can work around damage to the Broca's area. So people who have damage there, if they kind of musically set their sentences to a melody, they can actually become coherent again. So just some interesting side information there about Broca's area, and how although we might think of singing a phrase as being very similar to speaking a phrase, it's controlled in completely different parts of the brain, which is useful should we encounter damage to a given area. And then Wernicke's area, number 11, this is where we comprehend language. And this is where we actually build those neurons to actually comprehend and understand language. So then we have brainwaves. So brainwaves are a measure of the frequency at which electrical impulses are being produced in the brain. And we represent wave frequencies in hertz. So we can actually basically we're counting how many electrical impulses we're seeing. These were named in the order in which they were discovered. So alpha waves are actually when a person is asleep or really relaxed. And it was discovered first, so obviously that's why we have in the middle of the chart alpha. Beta is when you are awake, and then gamma is when you're highly focused or concentrating, and then theta and delta are the deep sleep waves. So the other portion of the central nervous system are the spinal nerves, the spinal cord, and it has different sections of spinal nerves coming off of it, and that's what you have here. You have a diagram outlining those spinal nerves. And this is just showing you, you do not have to write this down, this is just showing you kind of what's controlled off of those spinal nerves. All right, so let's talk about development. So at 3 to 4 weeks, an embryo is starting to see some development of the brain. And we have 3 sections of the brain. We have the rhomencephalon, and that's what we call the hindbrain. We have the mesencephalon, which is the midbrain, and we have the proencephalon, which is the forebrain. And those are going to further subdivide as we move further along in the fetal development into the myencephalon, the metaencephalon, the mesencephalon, the diencephalon, and the telencephalon. And those are going to continue folding and kind of growing in certain segments in order to get some preliminary brain. So here we have some very preliminary brain. You will notice that we do not have any folding, any gyruses or sulci, which are the like grooves are the sulci, and then the gyrus is the kind of like mound or like the like hills that we see on the later brain. And you can see that we do not have any of that folding yet. So we have just a very smooth hemisphere here, cerebral hemisphere. And then by the time we get to birth, the brain is basically what we would expect to see, like from a like construction standpoint. However, the size is very, very small compared to what we would see in an adult. It's about 10% the size it will end up being by the time the person fully develops. And so this is just showing you the same kind of thing we just talked about, just in a chart form, so you can kind of see what those things will become in case it was hard for you to track. So, what happens to the brain after birth? So, once we are born, by age 3, the structure of the brain is almost fully developed. And during this first 3 years of development, we are connecting millions of neurons. And all of those neurons are going to start interlocking. And this is a huge time for brain development. By ages 3 to 7, we start to see voluntary movement being able to be developed. So being able to decide how you want your body to move. We start to see some reasoning and some perception. We start to be able to think in symbolic terms. We start to be able to understand that money represents wealth, that kind of symbolic idea. And we gain, the brain grows incredibly rapidly, up to 80% of what it will be by the time it is an adult. And it is super excited to learn. The brain wants to gather as much information as possible at this stage. Here, by the time we see ages 7 to 12, we see that children begin to reason logically and start to be able to understand that. And then by the time we get to teens, those neural connections are really starting to strengthen, and we're starting to see some trimming, some neural trimming, where the connections are starting to reduce and become more refined and streamlined. And then we also see an adaptation in the level of reasoning. We can reason hypothetically, we can extrapolate out as we get through our teen years. And usually this process is completed by roughly age 25, although everyone is different. That is a wide spectrum. This may not be completed until 28, 29, depending on the individual. And then we do start to see some brain processing starting to slow down over time, and memory also starts to decline. Normal aging, we do start to see some cells start to die off, and the brain does start to shrink slightly, and we do start to see some cognitive loss, particularly around short-term memory, and we see some instability in movement. So the cerebellum starts to lose some reactivity. the neurons are still there. It's just that they react slower. They're not as good at sending along those electrical impulses. The protein channels are slower to act, that kind of thing. And the synapses are also slightly slower. So I just want to talk a little bit about the types of dementia. Dementia is a set of symptoms, and so we can actually see some different causes of dementia because it is a group of symptoms. And so you can start to see how many different things kind of get lumped in there. I just want to draw your attention to like vascular dementia. This is where like things like stroke or aneurysm have caused the kind of symptoms that we see, that severe loss of cognitive ability, that loss of memory, all of those kinds of things are the things we see with dementia. So as we start to talk about other types of brain disorders, there are some things I want you to remember, and that is that any disorder can be caused by damage or malformation of an anatomical structure. And so there are other possible causes as well, things like neurotransmitters not being produced or not functioning properly, as in they're not opening those channel proteins like they're supposed to. They're not being reabsorbed properly. So they're just floating through the synapses and causing neurons to fire at will. So there's a lot of different causes here. And so I just want those like standard causes to kind of be something we discussed first before we got into some of the disorders that we're going to touch on. So with Parkinson's, we see unintended or uncontrollable movements, such as shaking, sometimes like involuntary stiffness. This has implications for balance and coordination. And generally what we see here is a reduction in the volume of the midbrain. We also have epilepsy. This is where we have repeated seizures. This is where normally the brain has a very orderly process for electrical impulses. However, in epilepsy, what we see is that those electrical impulses are not following that pattern. They're firing at random, and it can cause traumatic, it can cause very dramatic symptoms. And this can be caused by a malformation, but also traumatic injury to the brain can also lead to epilepsy. We also have things like migraines. Migraines are a disorder of recurrent and moderate throbbing, pulsating pain in the brain. Usually it's located to one side of the brain, or one side of the head, sometimes on like one of the sides, or it could be in the front. There are some treatments for migraines, although sometimes just like avoiding triggers is the best we can do. And then we have multiple sclerosis. This is where the myelin sheaths are being attacked by the immune system, and they're actually breaking down those cells that make the myelin sheaths. And so this leads to poor neural response. Basically, the axons take forever to send electrical impulses because those ions are starting to float away from the axons. And so this leads to poor communication between the brain and the rest of the body. And it can be progressive and lead to complete loss of mobility and the ability to speak. Stroke is where we see a block in the blood supply. So there are tiny blood vessels throughout the brain that if you should get a clot in there, it can cause the blood vessel to burst, and all of that blood surrounding the brain can cause lasting brain damage. and long-term disability or even death. And one of the other ones we see is aneurysm. This is where a blood vessel bursts in the brain, similar to stroke, but it usually isn't tied to a clot necessarily. It's just that the blood vessel has sprung a leak. And so that will round out our central nervous system notes.